Blow, Scott Jennings, Adam Suhr, and also Peter Wehner. So, Peter, today President Trump was asked whether his administration will continue prosecuting families who come across the border. This is how he responded.
We have to have a very tough policy, otherwise you have millions and millions of people pouring into our country. We can't have that. We have no choice. We have to have a very strong border. If we don't, you'll have millions and millions of people. It'll look, what's happening today, look like child's play. It'll be a terrible thing if we ever did that. So we have to be very, very strong on the border. If we don't do it, you will be inundated with people, and you really won't have a country anymore. You know, without borders, you don't have a country.
So, Peter, you said to the Washington Post that the president takes, and this is a quote, a blowtorch to the tinder of a culture war about race and ethnicity. Is this part of that?
Sure it is, and so is his policy of separating children from parents. But so was his original announcement in June of 2015 when he came down the escalator and said that, implied that Mexicans coming across the border were primarily rapists and murderers. Again, this is the thread that goes through. Donald Trump is inconsistent, he flip-flops, he's volatile, but there is a malicious thread that runs through his presidency and his rhetoric, and it comes back to race and to ethnicity. That's the new culture war. Years ago, the culture war was defined by issues having to do with abortion, gay rights, and so forth. That's not the case now. Now it has to do with race and ethnicity. And you know, remember, race is the original sin in American life, and it has been the most consistently besetting sin. And Trump keeps coming back to it. The country has had presidents before who have been polarizing. That happens. What we've never had before is somebody who is so intentionally divisive and so intentionally malicious. That is,
so
he goes
often.
out of his, he does it all the time, and he does it with an intention to divide on these kind of fault lines of American society. Well, and so it's not a surprise that America is fracturing.
So Scott, Peter mentioned his rhetoric, and I just want to remind, and this is for you, so pay attention. I just want to remind our viewers what the president, how he has described immigrants in the past year.
We are bringing in some very bad people. We don't want this group of people anymore. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. I refer to them as animals, and guess what? I always will. The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be.
Scott, invoking fear to otherize immigrants, you think?
Well, I think the president has always been pretty clear that he does not want people who intend to commit crimes or criminal elements to come to the country. I think he's also been clear that he doesn't mind if we do have a legal immigration system where people, no matter their race, can come here as long as they're doing it in accordance with our laws. I don't agree with the president's views on refugees. I think the United States should frankly take in more refugees and set an example for the world. I've seen refugee camps all over the world, and there are a lot of people who need our help. And the United States has the room and the capacity to provide our help. But when it comes to immigration, the president has always said, I want a strong border. I want to tighten up the porous nature of the border. I want to have people coming in through points of entry where we know who's coming. And I want to make sure we're not letting in criminal element. I actually think those sentiments, most Americans agree with that. So especially when it comes to MS-13, which he's been very strong on. I don't think you necessarily are a racist if you want to have a border control and an immigration system in which you can track the folks that are coming here for the right reasons and the folks who are coming here to commit crimes.
But very quickly, Scott, the problem is
that is, maybe most Americans would agree with that, but it's also blind to history, right? So we wouldn't have a country if it was not flooded with criminals in the very beginning, right? So there's a period in the 1700s, like 1718 to about 1775, in which Britain was just sending criminals, literally sending their criminals. We always think about Australia, them sending their criminal to Australia. They only started to send the criminal to Australia when the American colonies started to revolt. And the people who were coming who weren't criminals were not their best. Britain wasn't sending its best to America. Only a few of the aristocracy of Europe came to America. These were peasants. So when you look at like what the founding of this country, the original citizens, the original colonists of this country, and you look at the people who are coming across the southern borders, and they kind of have the same kind of profile, right? There are some criminals, and we need to try to figure out, we don't want to have the people who are going to come to America and commit crimes, although that's exactly the kind of Europeans that we got in the beginning. But they're also peasants. They're kind of people who looking for a better opportunity, looking for a better opportunity to start over. And that's why people originally came to this country. I just find it just hypocritical when people say, well, America is built, is a country of laws, and it's not a country if it doesn't have borders. We can't have just anybody coming in, and they're not sitting their best. But that's exactly who we were. I don't understand. It's incredibly hypocritical. And if it's not hypocritical, it is completely blind to history.
So this is what you wrote in The Atlantic about the president's immigration policies, Adam. You said, to preserve the political and cultural preeminence of white Americans against a tide of demographic change, to keep America more white and less brown, the Trump administration has settled on a policy of systematic child abuse intended to intimidate prospective immigrants into submission. You say this has a lot of uncomfortable echoes of America's past, similar to what Charles is saying.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, the irony of the president's statement that we're not going to be a refugee camp, it's the president's policies that are turning the United States into a refugee camp. The United States doesn't need to prosecute every single person who tries to cross the border for misdemeanor illegal entry. In fact, when you do that, you have to house them, which means that you need to start looking for places to put people. And that diverts resources from prosecuting the people who are actually dangerous. So instead of focusing on the people who pose a threat to public safety, we are literally doing what the president says that he doesn't want to do, which is turning people into a refugee camp. And I think it's just very clear at this point that the president has a racial conception of citizenship, and there's a hierarchy in which white Americans at the top and the rest of us, are potentially a threat to that cultural preeminence. I mean, you could see it in the way that he talks about immigrants infesting the United States. Well, what do you do with an infestation? You exterminate it. I mean, that's dangerous language. But it's also reflected in the president's policies. I mean, something like separating families is not something you do when you respect people as human beings. It's something you do when you're incapable of that kind of respect.
So, Peter, let me read this because I know you want to weigh in, and I think this may help you make the whatever point that you're trying to make. This is new data from the U.S. Census Bureau. It shows that the number of non-Hispanic white people in this country decreased for the first time in the nation's history between 2015 and 2016. And then it shows that trend continued between 2016 and 2017 as non-whites grew. Do you think data is behind some of the support for President Trump?
Yeah, I think so, and I think the data shows it, and I think some of the social science shows it. There is a sense among some number of people, whites, that they're losing their country, that they're losing positions of influence, and that they're losing the culture. Look, I want to be clear, not everybody, obviously, who supports Donald Trump is a racist, but there is just simply no question that Trump's presidency and his pre-presidency was based on appeals to racism and this ethnic division. That list that Scott ran through, he said, the president has said this and this and this. Scott's a decent guy and a good guy, but that's not all he said, Scott. And if he had said it, it would be completely commonplace. What's different about this president, and you just have to acknowledge this, is that he does make these racial appeals. And we've seen it. We've saw it on a segment before we came on. And that is what's different here. And this is a malignancy. And this kind of thing and this kind of attitude, when a president does it, can really do tremendous civic and political damage to a country, and it can rile people up, and it can embolden the worst elements in American society. And what's happened is these groups that have always existed, that have been on the fringes, which is where they should be kept, and they were kept by people like George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. This is different, and now that they've been emboldened and they've been essentially pulled in, and that's just bad. This is like Lucy in the football saying Trump should say this, he should say that. He should say a lot of things. The trouble is he never does, and we're paying a cost for it.
What he's saying is you say, well, he wants to have strong borders and what have you, but we don't hear the good things about immigrants as much as we hear the negative things he has to say about immigrants. But I'll give you the last word. Go on.
Well, look, Pete and I disagree about some of what's going on in the Trump presidency, but on the issue of race in this country and the tensions around race, Don, we've talked about it a number of times on this show. I actually think it's one of the most worrisome civil society problems we have. I think both parties could do better. I think the president could do better. I hope he denounces or chooses to ignore and marginalize these people who are coming to the White House. And I hope we do wind up at a place where we get the border security that Americans want and also the immigration system that has made this country great and makes our economy strong. I think most Americans think we can do both. We can all do better on our rhetoric. That includes the president. So let's hope these kinds of conversations, civil, that we're having tonight, lead us into a better place.
Yeah. Listen, I understand what you're saying. This is beyond rhetoric, though. This is about something that this country has never really dealt with on a serious note. That there are people who feel guilty about what happened in the past, and therefore they are reticent to talk about it, discuss it, or even believe that it exists. And so, if it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. You're going to be guilty all your lives. But who are we as a country? And when are we going to finally face up to the ravages of slavery, of Jim Crow, and on and on? We haven't done it. And this president is certainly not helping. He's making it worse. Thank you all.
Thank you.
When we come back, intense pressure from Republicans and Democrats alike, forcing President Trump to cave on immigration. Could this be the issue which emboldens Republicans to challenge the president?